So today I want to continue our discussion about Old Testament law. And this is a really important topic to my heart because one of the passions of my life is helping myself and others, especially young people, with our ability to give an answer for the hope that's within us, give a reason for why we believe what we believe. And right now, people are asking like never before about the God of the Old Testament, about his laws. And so I think we have to be able to speak into these topics. The last time we were together, I shared with you some tools, 6 tools that are helping me as I'm examining Old Testament law. Excuse me. And I think I'll put those up on the screen for you, give you a little chance to look at those in case you weren't able to join us the last time we were together. If you are interested in more details about any of those, go back and check out that video, the first half of our talk about Old Testament law. Now, I had a lot of options for where I could go this direction in speaking about specific laws. There are lots of interesting and sometimes confusing, controversial laws all throughout the Tanakh or the Old Testament. But I decided to utilize our time today looking at a particular piece of scripture, namely Exodus 21, verses 2 through 11. It can be a bit controversial, perhaps a bit confusing. So I thought we'd look at that first today. So what I'd like to do is read it, and then we'll go verse by verse, just look to see what topics are covered in this piece of scripture. Exodus 21, starting with verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judge. He also shall bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. And if a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. And if he does not do these 3 for her, then she shall go out free without paying any money. Now, before we get into this bit of scripture, I want you to remember a few things, if you would. The first is that in this culture, not in Israel, but in this day, anyone could be sold for any reasons. There weren't really very many restrictions in the cultures around them on that. There were virtually no women's rights in this part of the world at this time. Also remember that probably the greatest enemy that most people faced was poverty and being on the streets and unprotected with no way to care for themselves or protect themselves. Especially women and children found themselves in complete vulnerability, very vulnerable to being victimized and exploited. That's really important for us to remember, and it'll have to do with what we discuss here today. We should also keep in mind that regarding the exchange of money for young ladies, in this era, in this part of the world, it was the norm to exchange money related to betrothal, related to marriage. We'll be talking in some detail about that in just a minute. Also, please remember that just like we talked about last time, when you see the word if at the beginning of a law, almost all of the time you are going to see right after that, you're going to see if you do a certain behavior, you are going to see restrictive language about that behavior. Please remember that if does not mean that Yahweh is endorsing this behavior. It means it's a behavior that is already in practice. Yahweh is now going to say, if you participate in this behavior, which he is not necessarily endorsing, he is going to place unprecedented restrictions on that behavior. And finally, I'll just tell you up front that it is my belief that this piece of scripture does some revolutionary things toward protecting women's rights, protecting their safety, and protecting their freedom. So I'll tell you that up front, and I'll present some evidence to you. See if you see it the same way when we get finished. So let's go ahead and start. We'll start right off with verse 2 of this scripture. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. The first thing that we need to remind ourselves of is what is the Torah? What are these first 5 books? We need to remember that they are not, these are not pieces of literature that are letters written particularly to you or me here in the 21st century. These are not even inspirational religious writings. What the Torah, those first 5 books, including Exodus, what they are is a set of legal documents used for governing a nation. And as I heard Brad Scott a couple weeks ago at the Revive conference, and he also said the Torah is a set of laws for a nation and a bunch of stories about people, some of whom obeyed Yahweh and some who didn't, and how that worked out for them. So please keep that in mind. When we're reading this bit of Exodus 21, we are reading national law concerning how to deal with people in particular situations. This is national law. Now, in this, when we're dealing with these Hebrew slaves who have fallen into this situation, remember they are in this situation because of financial situations. So the way that this worked, someone with some money would have the opportunity to pay off the debt of a particular person, and then that man would come and work for them for no more than 6 years. Regardless of the size of the debt, you couldn't work for more than 6 years. Now, often, that man would bring him in to work doing the trade that the man did. So as a byproduct of this whole process, this person who is in debt would now learn a particular trade. He would also observe and often be purposely taught financial responsibility while he was there. And then when that slave was released, the Torah required that gifts be given to him, and that was for the purpose of him going out and giving life a try a second time and perhaps doing better. So please remember, as we think about these rules as being national laws to help deal with a situation of people who are in poverty, they're not written with the understanding of each person's individual case. So some of these people who found themselves in debt, perhaps they met a catastrophe in life, and they were really great financial managers. But many of them were going to be people who were unable or unwilling to be responsible in their finances. So that is who this law is really written about. And there are some protective clauses written in here with that assumption in mind. Now we start in verse 3. We start beginning to see, once that 6 years is over, how these people are released. All right, so verse 3 says that if this man comes into this situation by himself, he just goes out by himself, and the master hopes that he does better the next time around. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. Now, there are some things that we know about this man if he is married. We know, of course, that he fell into hard times. We know that he's married. We also know that during those hard times, he didn't abandon his wife. She would have been an extra mouth to feed. He didn't abandon her, but kept her with him all the way till the point where they were sold into slavery. So we know there is a degree of loyalty, and we can predict what he'll do if he falls into this situation again. So because of that, he's allowed to take his wife with him when he goes back into freedom. This next little portion of Scripture, it's important to us as we look at this next portion of Scripture that we understand, once again, the greatest threat that these people faced was the threat of being on the street alone, especially with no money, especially women and children. Okay, so there's another scenario now that this is going to apply to. In verse 4, if his master has given him a wife and she has borne him sons or daughters. So now this is a different scenario. This is a man who was when he was free, he was not able to manage himself financially. He comes into this situation, and he is obviously required to go to work every day. He is in a very restricted environment, and while he's in that restricted environment, he gets a wife, and they have children together. Now, everything is going well. They're eating 3 meals a day at this point. But now it's time for him to go back on the street. And for anyone who knows somebody who's been in a detention center, a halfway house, or they've been in prison, anyone who has a loved one who's been in those situations, you can probably relate to this moment when you find out that they've been doing well under a restricted environment, but now is the time that they're going to be able to have freedom. You sort of hold your breath, not knowing how will they handle freedom. Will they repeat the pattern that they did when they were, the pattern that they were involved in when they were on the streets before? Well, that's the same scenario that this law has to take into account. We don't know why this person fell into financial instability, but we know now he has women and children under his care. So the law does not allow that man to take those women and children out onto the street, because really his life is going to be an experiment. We are now going to find out whether he is able to manage his finances or not. The law will not allow the women and the children to be placed in that vulnerable situation. So they stay in that position in the master's house. They're going to keep eating 3 meals a day. They're going to keep being cared for. And so at this point, the guy has some options. He can leave by himself. He can walk away from his wife and children and never see them again, and that would probably tell us something about his character. He has another option that is spoken about in this bit of scripture. He has the option of saying, I love my master, I love my wife, I love my children, and we're in a stable situation here. I'm going to keep working here where I know that we can be protected, where we're going to be financially okay. He can do that. He has a third option that isn't spoken of directly here, but it is a third option for him. That's to go out on his own and make money and bring his wife and children out. He can do that as well, and that would alleviate the question as to whether he's going to provide for them. So there are some options. Really, the options are in the man's hands, not so much in the master's. So he gets to make that choice. And the whole time, the women and the children are protected from being out and uncared for out on the streets. So that's what happens in that scenario. The women are not sent out. Now that master needs to think twice before he brings women and children into his care, because he is held responsible for them and cannot push them out onto the street. Now, is there ever going to be a time that a family would find themselves in bondage, or probably found themselves in bondage in that situation because they had a bad master that somehow took advantage of the situation? I'm sure that there were people who were endangered in that way. But really that speaks to humanity. It doesn't speak to Torah. It doesn't really speak to Yahweh's laws. Yahweh's laws were set in place to protect the most vulnerable. And then, granted, I'm sure there were some masters that found loopholes and attempted as much as possible to take advantage. But the law was still a good justice-oriented law. And then we go into verse 7, and it's really the same topic. If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, and we'll talk about that selling in just a moment, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. The same scenario. So for us here in the West, especially we women, it kind of makes our skin crawl to think about not being released. That's because we live in such an affluent society, and we have the freedom and the ability to, if we were released, we'd knock on doors and get a job, and we would find a way to provide for ourselves. It really wasn't like that. So if a woman found herself under the care of a master, it would be a very horrible thing for her, in most cases, to be put out onto the street. She wouldn't really have much option to keep herself alive. But here I want to get into now the selling of your daughters. Remember again, I mentioned earlier, this next piece of scripture in verse 8 is talking about, verse 7 touches on it, and then verse 8, it's talking about exchanging money in the context of betrothal and marriage. And as we go through verse 8, I think you'll see it's very clear that we're talking about marriage. Please remember that Leviticus 19:29 says that it is forbidden for a father to sell his daughter into prostitution. We are all, with good reason, on high alert about human trafficking for the sake of prostitution. That is not what this is talking about. It's talking about betrothal, and it was the norm of the day in all cultures for money to be exchanged surrounding betrothal. Often the girl was involved in whether this was going to happen, but we can't guarantee that that was always the case. But we do know that in this case that's talked about in Exodus 21, the way it would work is a man who had some money, would come to a family and say, I would like to marry your daughter. The implication, the assumption on with all parties, and hopefully with the groom as well, is that he plans to be a husband to this young lady. He plans to be a husband for life and plans to have children with her. Now that would also ensure she's cared for in the moment, and it would also ensure that she would have children, which is extremely important in this society because nobody wanted to grow old without children, because that is how you would be cared for when you were old. So that was the situation. This girl, her family, believed that she would go into this marriage and be there forever. But we know how the human heart can be, and we know that in every society, including our own, someone could get married thinking that they're going to be married until the end of their life, only to find out that their spouse is no longer pleased with them and wants to put them out on the street. It continues to happen today. So God knew that this society, the way they were doing things, where they were exchanging money for the transfer of a person living here to another home, he put some restrictive clauses in his law to protect those young ladies, even though that is what was going on in society. And in verse 8, we read, if she does not please her master, and the implication is now he's ready to get rid of her, who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. That means she's allowed to go back to her family. He doesn't have an option. It says he shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people. This is unheard of. If a man had a wife, he could put her anywhere and do anything he wanted with her in most of the cultures around them. But Yahweh said it will not be that way with my people. You have to allow her to go back to her family. So her family would bring her back to themselves, and they would give back the money that he had handed to them. A relative could do that. A community member, a friend, could redeem her. She had to be allowed to go back to her family, and it was forbidden that he sell her to a foreign people, since he had dealt deceitfully with her. Now this is absolutely revolutionary. Yahweh is saying that it matters if you deal deceitfully with a woman. This is uncommon in the cultures of this day. In this time, in this part of the world, it doesn't matter if you deceive a woman. A woman has no rights. But Yahweh says it isn't so in his law. He says, you dealt deceitfully with her. You can't just sell her and put her away. He has clauses in here to protect these women. And if he has betrothed her to his son, so sometimes this man would go and say, I'd like your daughter to be my son's wife. And it says if he's done that, he needs to deal with her according to the custom of daughters. So he can't bring her into his home and then treat her like a slave. She's to be treated like his daughter. These are all protective clauses on behalf of the women. If he takes another wife, that son or the man, whoever is betrothed to her, he takes another wife. Now, I think this is a glaring example of what I was talking about last time we were together. This concept that we will see the word if. It does not mean God is endorsing a certain behavior. When we see if, Yahweh is about ready to restrict a behavior that is already in practice. And that is certainly the case here, I believe. In the beginning, when that first family was created in the Garden of Eden, we see a man and one woman, not several women. We see that being the model that God has for family. Then much later in the New Testament, we see that if a man is going to be in leadership in the body of Messiah, he's to have only one wife. wife. So I believe that God is speaking that it is not his intention for us to have many spouses or for men to take many wives. But as we spoke about before, he says if, because he knows you are probably, some of you are going to take other wives. So I'm going to put some restrictions on that already rampant behavior that's running rampant through your culture. He says if he takes another wife, he shall not diminish that first wife's food, her clothing, or her marriage rights. Remember, the marriage rights are her opportunity to have children, to care for her when she is old. He is not allowed to do that. In other cultures at that time, there's no restriction on the men. They could take a new wife that was younger and more beautiful and diminish the food and clothing and marriage rights of the first one. It made no difference at all. But Yahweh said it won't be like that among my people. So he protects that woman. And then verse 11 is absolutely revolutionary in the time in which it happened. If he does not do these three for her, then if he doesn't give her her basic needs, she shall go out free without paying any money. This is an unprecedented kind of thing that Yahweh is doing. He says that if the basic needs of this woman are not met, the law will stand behind the woman and not behind the man. She can walk out free. She can go back to her family. She is allowed to leave. This is remarkable. So this piece of scripture that we've sometimes, if we read it quickly, we can think that we can have accusations against our Father and think that he is endorsing the mistreatment of women. But actually, he is working inside of a society that is running rampant with abuses and injustices toward the vulnerable, especially toward women. And he is coming to the defense of women. He's an amazing God. So that's a little food for thought about Exodus 21. And the next time we get together, I want to look at some stuff from the New Testament. Until we get together again, I pray that you have abundant peace and joy in every area of your life. Until then, shalom.